Hey, this is Eternal King here bringing you another LOR video today. So last video we spent a great deal of time talking about the new Eternal meta. Um, and that was, a very diverse and very interesting and fun video. I also want to take a moment to talk about the standard shifts for those that enjoy that format. So I'm not going to bother showing you the lists because unlike Eternal, where it's hard to find deck lists and it's hard to find people who have expertise in that format, when it comes to Standard, it's pretty ubiquitous and it's pretty straightforward. But I'll still run through the changes that happened after the patch, just for those that are interested. So first up, the biggest thing that happened off of the Eddie nerfs is that the game has shifted slightly away from tempo mid-range back to aggro. That was kind of the biggest thing that happened. So Annie Jin in standard is currently the top standard deck. So again, top standard decks and top Eternal decks, they typically hit that 56% win rate benchmark, and that's how you know that it is a top deck. So Annie Jin is hitting that right now. We also have Zed Gwen being a very strong deck right now. So, aggro back in full swing at 56% win rate. And then, Pike being kind of the third aggro deck that's doing a little less well because, again, Pike was nerfed. And honestly, I think that was for the best. He's hanging out at 53%. So again, aggro, very solid choice at the beginning of this standard season. I don't see that changing off of all of the kind of after all the nerfs to kind of Eddie decks. I don't see aggro doing any worse in standard because standard is very much an open swing kind of format. You can open swing with aggro cards, or you can open swing with sort of mid-rangey tempo cards, but either way you're kind of open swinging, and that's how that game plays. Now let's talk about the mid-range decks that are doing well. So it is the stuff from last season, pretty much. So Ash, Frostbite mid-range, has kind of it's long been a staple of standard decks or the standard format. Does very well. So Ash, Frostbite mid-range, at one point was the top standard deck, but it's still performing just fine. And then you have, Eddie Galio, Morgana, the three-way split that was, the terror of last season. It's still around, and it's performing about 53%. So it's more of a healthy deck now as opposed to just like flat out the only deck you should play. Now it's just a deck that you can play, so that's a good spot for Galio, Eddie, Morgana to be in. And then, yeah, you have Mordekaiser as well, kind of performing in that mid-range position and putting up similar numbers. So again, these mid-range decks more like 53% as opposed to sort of Annie and Zed Gwen being better at 56% because aggro being slightly better than tempo mid-range right now. So that's the standard format. Not a ton of interesting things to discuss. As opposed to Eternal, where I get to talk about like 12 decks. Standard is more limited. Usually it's like 6 decks that are good. And last season it was literally 1 deck or 2 decks if you include elusives. But let's talk about something else. And that since I use up the full time of the video and people don't feel gypped on the subject. If you are attempting to transition from Standard to Eternal, maybe because you don't like the current meta, maybe you don't like how the patch has affected the meta, or maybe you're just sick of Standard and you want to change, the biggest advice I can give you is don't open attack. So the best thing that every single Standard deck has in common in LOR is open attack pressure, right? So Annie open attacks, Zed Gwen open attacks. A lot of this tempo mid-rangey stuff, open attacks with formidable units. Just everything is open attack pressure. Just like, do you have a unit on board? Does your opponent, have fewer units on board than you? Well, the answer is probably open attack, right? And you can just do that safely. Eternal is very, very different. Pretty much every single good Eternal deck does not play off of open attack pressure. So, Aziravelli is a great example. If you want to be good at, say you're just starting out Eternal and you've never played the format before, this is a great starter deck. And the biggest mistake I see with Aziravelli is people open swing because they're trained from that from Standard. No, pretty much 100% of the time, the way this deck works is you want to Blade Dance first. So if you don't know, you play Aurelia. She gives you a flawless duet. So you Blade Dance after you develop the Aurelia, and then you swing afterwards. And the reason why you do that is because of Sparring Student and because of Green Glade Duo. So everything about this deck is designed to essentially develop, Blade Dance, and then swing. And that's kind of the play pattern of this deck, which is like the opposite of how Standard works. And I can, kind of do this all day. You have ramp decks, which again, I've said ramp is bad right now, but just for the example, ramp decks tend to open pass because they have Avalanche and Blighted Ravine and, some number of harsh winds usually. So they tend to open pass and then ramp, or they just, commit to the ramp. But either way, they're not really swinging. They're not open swinging, right? You're not swinging until something big lands, like the Trundle. But sometimes you don't even swing with the Trundle. Usually the Enraged Fire Spitter is like the first unit that swings in ramp. So like ramp never open swings because you're just, basically spending your spell mana and passing. Deep is an example of, you play your units out, and deep is very defensive. So you're basically, playing your units out, you're blocking, you're tossing, and then you're casting spells in response. So no open attacks off of deep. Elusive spam, elusive spam might be the closest thing to a standard deck where like you're open swinging, but even though you're open swinging, you're usually burst committing the spell mana during the open swing. So even that's a little different. You're burst committing spell mana and buffing those units during the open swing. So even that's like a little different than standard. Meta Draven Rumble, like if you have the Rumble, you play the Rumble. Like that's, you never open swing on mana 4 because you have the Rumble, and Rumble has Spell Shield. So you don't swing until you play the Rumble, and then you swing after you play the Rumble. There is not a single Eternal deck that I can think of where open swinging is the answer. Meta Thresh Nasus. Typically with Meta Thresh Nasus, you're going to want to be slaying your own units. And that's your priority there. So at the end of the day, you don't really care about open attack pressure very much. Like sure, you'll take the damage where you can because it makes Atrocity lethal a little easier, but a lot of the time you're just slaying your units and kind of solitaring until you get your big Nasus down. Most decks that are good in Eternal do not play off of open attack pressure. And the more that you get away from this mentality that open attacks are good, the better you'll be at this format. Twisted Fate is a great example. You play the Twisted Fate, and then you play the Sunken Temple, and then you pass. That's all you do. You play the Twisted Fate, you do, presumably there's stuff that you play your junk units, and you cycle, and you cycle, and you cycle, but really, you play your Twisted Fate, you play your Sunken Temple, and then you pass. And that's how this deck plays. And then you can basically say, okay, you got an answer, or if you don't have an answer, then you have level Twisted Fate, and then you win the game. So, there is not a single example I can think of where open attacking is good. If you're memeing with Hecarim, you play the Hecarim and then you swing, right? Unless you played the Hecarim last turn and then you swing. Then you open attack. But most of the time you're developing your ephemerals and then swinging, right? So very seldom do you ever open attack with Hecarim. It's just very rarely the answer. I think the only deck that goes for open attack pressure is literally Ziggs Poppy. Ziggs Poppy being kind of one of the more linear Eternal decks. And you know what? I take it back. If you're starting out in Eternal, don't play Azir Aurelia. Play Ziggs Poppy. Ziggs Poppy is the closest thing to Annie Aggro. So if you're coming off of Annie Aggro, which is the best standard deck right now, and you want like a perfect transition, then you go to Ziggs Poppy. And if you play Ziggs Poppy, you'll do very well. Yeah, so again, a little extra talk because the standard meta discussion wasn't that interesting. You have your top 3 aggro decks, you have your top 3 mid-range decks, and control and combo doesn't exist in that format. But yeah, so a little extra kind of fun chat about transitioning from standard to Eternal if you're interested in doing so. Alright, this is Eternal King signing out.